And so in Hong Kong, I met with a whole bunch of different companies like Disney and Microsoft that invest in China and have problems with intellectual property. And the head of intellectual property for Microsoft in Asia was really, really excited because last year, 85% of Microsoft products in China were fakes. Why was she excited about that? Because it used to be 95%. So like, this is a huge change, and Microsoft is really, really excited about it. But Microsoft makes 1/20th of the amount of money it would make in China if the fakes weren't on the market. So it's a huge lack of investment. You just lose everything. So, why is it so bad? Well, like I said, there's a history of imitation in China. In other words, intellectual property is a foreign concept, right? So the Chinese are kind of like, yeah, well, we like to copy things, so why should we protect this now? And when they first started introducing intellectual property legislation, the Science Commission in China was like, no, we don't want patent legislations. No. We want to continue using everyone else's patents without having to pay them for them. Right? But it's the Science Commission that should be innovating, that should be creating things that need intellectual property. But at the time, it was such a foreign concept that even the scientists were like, no, we don't want this. At the same time, all of you know that China joined the World Trade Organization in 2001. And China created a stipulation in its accession agreements that say that only 20 foreign films can be shown in China every year. Did any of you guys know that? 20 foreign films. There are 20 foreign films playing in one Australian movie theater in 1 week, and then the next week you get more and more. So what is China going to do? Everybody wants to watch movies in China, so what do? You make fakes. And you sell them on the street, because there's a huge demand. And if there's a demand in the market, it's going to be filled. So if you can only show 20 movies, there's going to be a huge fakes world that people want to buy. And so 1/5 of the population in China is involved in the counterfeit industry. 1/5, okay? It's not just the counterfeiters, it's exporters, it's judges, it's local government officials, it's customs agents, everybody. Everybody is involved. And it's really complicated to stop the production of fakes when 1/5 of the population is reliant in some form on money from this industry. So, even though the regime is the biggest in the world, the biggest copyright protection regime in the world, the biggest patent protection industry in the world, still, the counterfeit industry is bigger. So it's a pretty tough situation that China is having to deal with right now. Local officials get kickbacks from counterfeiters, so they don't want to shut down the operations. And some agencies in China whose roles are to protect intellectual property actually work alongside the counterfeiters to make more money off of them. So there's a total disincentive to stop pirating. What about the legal structure? You laugh. Okay, does anybody want to guess how many lawyers there were in China in 1979? A little bit higher, but only just. There were 200 lawyers in China in 1979. 200, that's it. Now there are over 1 billion people in China, and there are only 100,000 lawyers. Okay? That's one lawyer for every 12,000 people. In this room alone, I'm sure you guys have filed multiple lawsuits, right? And there's probably, not that many people in this room. Imagine if there was one lawyer for half of the university campus, right? In Australia, for example, there's one lawyer for every 500 people. But in China, it's one for every 12,000. So China has a lot of growing pains. Its legal system is very new, and it's learning a lot. How does the legal system work? What can we use it for? How do we make it effective in protecting the rule of law? And intellectual property is very much a part of that. Judges are still appointed by the Communist Party, so there's no independent judicial system. There's no contempt of court laws in China, so if a counterfeiter comes in and says, like, this is not a fake good, I created this good, and you can't prove them wrong, you can't charge them with contempt of court. There's also no system of precedent in the Chinese legal system. So if a lower court in a province that may or may not be getting kickbacks from counterfeiters decides that it wants to rule in favor of a counterfeiter, it can go against any precedent that's set in a bigger court in a bigger city where IP may be more or better protected. So the legal situation is difficult. And then what about enforcement? Well, the laws are still new for intellectual property enforcement, and it's a little bit awkward. For example, if you want to create a criminal case against a counterfeiter, you have to find them with 20,000 pieces of a counterfeit good. So what do? Well, you just split up your stock, right? You put 5,000 over here, 19,999 over here, and 40 over here, and then you can't prosecute them criminally. Pretty easy, right? Simple. You can just evade prosecution. And then they also have, as you see in these pictures, these tsunami-style crackdowns, as they're called, where a huge amount of government officials will storm into a place that's known for selling copyrighted goods or pirated goods, and they'll crack down and they'll arrest people and they'll steal all the goods. Well, a lot of times, they then sell back the goods that they got in the raids to the counterfeiters, and then they're resold, or they sell them themselves. And a lot of times, the local officials tell the people that there's a raid that's about to happen, so they can hide their stock or separate it. So it's kind of a complicated situation. So, what does this mean? China wants to update its economy to more high-tech and innovative products. But Chinese and foreign companies are not going to invest in research and development for these things until the intellectual property protection is strong enough for their investments to be protected. But the Chinese government isn't going to update the intellectual property legislation until Chinese companies lobby them to do so. But Chinese companies aren't going to lobby them to do so because Chinese companies aren't investing in research and development. So you have this whole chicken and egg situation that high-tech R&D investment isn't happening, so the companies aren't lobbying, so the enforcement's not getting better, and so they're not investing, and they're not lobbying, and it's not getting better, and they're not investing, and they're not lobbying, and it's not getting better. And so it's a pretty difficult situation. What I found in Hong Kong, meeting with all of these companies, is that actually now there are a lot of Chinese companies coming forward to the government and saying, we need better protection, we need our intellectual property to be protected because we want to invest in things and we want to create things and we want to be a global economy that is advanced and that is comparable to Japan or the United States or some of the things in the EU. They want to be a part of that. And at the moment, they can't. And why can't they? Well, China's got other problems. China's got massive inflation. It's got huge political problems internally, some of which we don't even know about because the media is so tightly controlled in China. But if you've seen the Jasmine gatherings that happened earlier this year, people are starting to protest and they want more money, and they want more rights, they want more freedoms, they want more access. And at the same time, prices are skyrocketing in China, and nobody's happy about it. So, if you've got 1/5 of the population involved in the counterfeit industry, and all of a sudden you crack down on the counterfeit industry, and you've got 1/5 of the population out of work, you're going to have a lot more political problems. You're going to have a lot more protesting, and problems are going to be a lot worse. So China hasn't prioritized increasing intellectual property enforcement because it's got all these other problems that it has to deal with first. So just to conclude, China has a long way to go before it surpasses the United States economy. And it might do that. But if China really wants to become this advanced economy that it's saying that it wants to be, and if you read anything that's said by any Chinese government officials about their economy, they're all saying, we want to advance, we want to invest. But unless it can diversify into more high-tech products, it's not going to be able to be that advanced economy that everyone thinks it's going to be. So, on the one hand, the United States wants China to increase its intellectual property laws so that that US companies can really maximize the benefits they get from investing in China. At the same time, the US likes to be on top, so they don't really want China to become that advanced. So in that way, it's hard for the US, on the one hand, to desire these stronger intellectual property rights, but also want to maintain their supremacy over the Chinese economy. So basically, that's what I studied in Hong Kong. That's what I was doing. And what we were doing with the companies, the US companies, was talking to them about due diligence, right? If you want to invest in China, how do you protect your intellectual property? And it's really interesting. A lot of US companies that invest in China do so because they hear it's a great place to go, and they never do anything to protect their intellectual property. They don't register their copyrights, they don't file their patents before Chinese companies do, and there's a different patent situation in China than there is in the US, but I won't go into that. But they don't do the things that you have to do to protect your intellectual property. They hear there's a lot of money to be made in China, and they just invest. And so you hear all these US companies, and probably Australian companies too, complaining about how their intellectual property is appropriated in China, but they haven't done the work to protect their intellectual property. So anyways, it's a really, really fascinating subject. And the thing is, counterfeiters are getting more and more advanced, and it's going to become harder and harder to stop them. So it's really important that enforcement and the legal protections for intellectual property in China become updated soon. But yeah, so that's what I wanted to talk to you guys about today. I don't know if any of you have questions. I'm happy to answer anything about myself or my history as well. But just so you know, intellectual property in China is really fascinating, and I'm happy to talk about it over email with anyone.